Have you ever wondered why certain chapters of human history seem deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of theological interpretation and cultural assumptions that have shaped our understanding for centuries? Tonight, we're about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical genealogy and the origins of humanity's diverse populations. What I'm about to reveal isn't just another theological discussion or academic exercise. This is a deep dive into ancient texts, forgotten manuscripts, and biblical passages that have been systematically overlooked or misinterpreted by mainstream religious institutions. We're talking about revelations that could fundamentally reshape how we understand the divine blueprint for human diversity and the specific roles different populations were destined to play in the unfolding drama of human civilization. Picture this scenario. You're holding a manuscript that contains detailed genealogical records spanning thousands of years. These aren't vague references or symbolic allegories. These are precise lineages, specific blessings, and prophetic destinies that were recorded by ancient scribes who understood their profound significance. The text describes not just the origin of different peoples, but their unique characteristics, their geographical dispersions, and their roles in the grand tapestry of divine purpose. But here's what makes this investigation so compelling. The biblical narrative about human origins isn't the simplified story most people learned in Sunday school. Hidden within the genealogies of Genesis, embedded in the prophetic utterances of the patriarchs, and scattered throughout the historical books of Scripture, we find detailed accounts of how different populations emerged, where they settled, and what specific blessings and destinies were placed upon each lineage. The story begins in the aftermath of humanity's greatest catastrophe. After the floodwaters receded and the earth began to dry, Noah and his family stepped onto a cleansed world. But this wasn't just a story about survival and new beginnings. According to the ancient texts, this was the moment when the foundations for all future civilizations were established through the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, pause for a moment and consider the implications. If every person alive today descends from these three men, then understanding their individual characteristics, their specific blessings, and their prophetic destinies becomes crucial to understanding the entire human story. The biblical text doesn't present these three brothers as identical figures who simply scattered in different directions. Instead, it describes each one as carrying distinct traits, receiving specific promises, and establishing lineages that would shape the character and fate of entire continents. But here's where the narrative takes a fascinating turn that most theological discussions completely overlook. The blessing pronounced over Ham wasn't a curse, despite centuries of misinterpretation that have distorted our understanding of this crucial biblical passage. When we examine the original Hebrew text, study the historical context, and trace the actual fulfillment of these prophetic words, a completely different picture emerges. Ham, whose name in Hebrew carries meanings related to warmth, heat, and the burning intensity of the sun, was blessed to become the father of nations that would establish some of history's most magnificent civilizations. The biblical record makes it clear that from Ham's lineage would come peoples of extraordinary capability, architectural genius, and cultural sophistication that would astound the world for millennia. Consider the genealogical record as it unfolds in Genesis chapter 10. From Ham came 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Each of these names isn't just a personal identifier, but represents entire populations that would spread across Africa and establish the foundations of human civilization. Cush, settling in the region we now call Ethiopia and Sudan, would establish kingdoms renowned for their wealth, military prowess, and spiritual wisdom. Mizraim, whose descendants populated Egypt, would create architectural marvels and technological achievements that continue to baffle modern engineers. The biblical text describes these populations in terms that reveal divine favor rather than divine judgment. When Scripture speaks of the land of Cush, it's often in terms of abundance, prosperity, and strategic importance. The prophet Isaiah speaks of messengers from Cush, swift ambassadors traveling across the waters, suggesting a people known for their communication skills and international influence. The book of Psalms declares that princes shall come out of Egypt and that Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God, indicating a prophetic destiny of leadership and spiritual significance. But the story becomes even more remarkable when we examine the specific individuals who emerged from Ham's lineage. Nimrod, described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, established the first great empire in human history. The text tells us he was the beginning of his kingdom, suggesting not just political power, but the very concept of organized civilization flowing from his leadership. This wasn't primitive tribalism, but sophisticated urban planning, architectural innovation, and administrative complexity that laid the foundation for all subsequent human societies. The cities Nimrod established, Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, weren't simple settlements but centers of learning, commerce, and technological development. Archaeological evidence from these ancient sites reveals mathematical sophistication, astronomical knowledge, and engineering capabilities that suggest access to advanced understanding far beyond what conventional historical timelines would suggest possible. Even more intriguing is the biblical description of the Tower of Babel project. Rather than a primitive attempt to reach heaven through crude construction, the Hebrew text suggests this was a sophisticated technological endeavor that caught the attention of divine beings. The Lord's statement that nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them indicates recognition of extraordinary capability rather than condemnation of misguided ambition. When we trace the migrations of Ham's descendants across the African continent, we find populations establishing advanced civilizations that would influence human development for thousands of years. The kingdom of Cush produced rulers who conquered and governed Egypt during the 25th dynasty, bringing cultural renaissance and architectural achievements that rival any civilization in human history. The wealth and sophistication of these African kingdoms were so renowned that they became legendary even in distant lands. The biblical narrative becomes even more fascinating when we examine the specific prophecies and blessings associated with different branches of Ham's family tree. The text suggests that these populations weren't just randomly scattered across the earth, but were strategically positioned to fulfill specific roles in the divine plan for human civilization. Some were destined to be pioneers of technology and architecture. Others were called to be keepers of wisdom and spiritual insight. Still others were appointed to serve as bridges between different peoples and cultures. The geographical distribution described in Scripture aligns remarkably with what we know about the spread of advanced civilizations across Africa. From the Nile Valley civilizations that gave the world mathematics, medicine, and monumental architecture, to the great kingdoms of Nubia that controlled trade routes and influenced cultures across continents, to the sophisticated societies of West Africa that developed metallurgy, astronomy, and complex social structures centuries before similar achievements emerged elsewhere. But perhaps most significantly, the biblical text suggests that Ham's descendants carry within their genetic and cultural inheritance specific capabilities that would enable them to thrive in environments and circumstances that would challenge other populations. The association with warmth and heat in Ham's very name suggests divine programming for success in climates and conditions where others might struggle. This isn't about limitation, but about specialized excellence, divine adaptation for specific purposes and environments. The prophetic dimensions become even more compelling when we examine how these ancient promises have been fulfilled throughout history. The biblical prediction that Ham's descendants would be numerous and mighty finds validation in the demographic realities of African populations. The promise of territorial expansion and cultural influence can be traced through the historical spread of African peoples and their contributions to civilizations across the globe. What emerges from this biblical investigation isn't a story of curse or limitation, but a narrative of divine purpose, specific calling, and extraordinary capability. The populations descended from Ham weren't afterthoughts in the divine plan, but essential participants chosen for specific roles that would shape human civilization in ways that continue to influence our world today. The ancient texts suggest that understanding these origins isn't just about historical curiosity, but about recognizing the divine blueprint for human diversity. Each lineage carries unique gifts, specific callings, and prophetic destinies that contribute to the complete picture of human potential. When we grasp the true biblical narrative about Ham's descendants, we begin to see how divine wisdom established different populations with complementary capabilities designed to work together in fulfilling humanity's ultimate purpose. This understanding challenges contemporary assumptions about human equality by suggesting something far more profound: divine intentionality in human diversity. Rather than all populations being identical with surface variations, the biblical model presents different lineages as carrying distinct genetic and spiritual programming designed for specific functions within the broader human story. As we continue this investigation, we'll explore how these biblical origins connect to specific historical achievements, geographical settlements, and cultural developments that validate the extraordinary promises made to Ham's descendants. We'll examine archaeological evidence that supports the biblical timeline, trace migration patterns that align with scriptural prophecies, and discover how ancient blessings continue to manifest in contemporary realities. The story we're uncovering isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and recognizing the future roles that different populations are destined to play as human history reaches its climactic moments. The biblical narrative suggests that Ham's descendants carry within their heritage keys to understanding, capabilities for innovation, and spiritual insights that will be crucial for humanity's ultimate transformation. What you're about to discover will challenge every assumption you've been taught about race, divine purpose, and human potential. The evidence we'll present comes not from speculation or cultural interpretation, but from careful analysis of biblical texts, historical records, and prophetic promises that have been systematically overlooked by mainstream theological discourse. Prepare yourself for revelations that will fundamentally alter how you understand the divine plan for human civilization and the specific roles different populations were chosen to fulfill. The biblical account of Ham's lineage isn't a footnote in human history, but a central narrative that explains some of the most extraordinary achievements in human civilization and points toward even greater fulfillments yet to come. The threads of this ancient tapestry are about to be woven together in ways that reveal the magnificent scope of divine intention for the peoples descended from Ham. What emerges will astound you with its precision, validate your highest expectations about divine purpose, and challenge you to see human diversity not as accidental variation, but as intentional design for accomplishing purposes that transcend anything we've previously imagined possible. The magnitude of what we're uncovering becomes even more staggering when we examine the specific territories that Ham's descendants were divinely appointed to inhabit and develop. These weren't random migrations or accidental settlements. According to the biblical record, each branch of Ham's family tree was strategically positioned across the African continent and beyond to establish centers of learning, innovation, and spiritual authority that would influence human civilization for millennia. Let's trace this remarkable geographical blueprint as it unfolds in Scripture. The text reveals that Cush, Ham's eldest son, established his domain in the region extending from modern-day Sudan through Ethiopia and into parts of southern Arabia. But this wasn't just territorial expansion. The biblical description suggests that Kushite civilization represented something unprecedented in human development. These were peoples destined to master the arts of governance, military strategy, and international diplomacy on a scale that would make their influence felt across continents. The historical evidence supporting this biblical narrative is overwhelming, yet it's been systematically ignored or minimized by academic institutions that prefer simpler explanations for human achievement. Archaeological discoveries throughout the Nile Valley reveal technological sophistication that challenges everything we've been taught about the development of human capability. We're talking about mathematical precision in architectural design, astronomical calculations that demonstrate advanced understanding of celestial mechanics, and metallurgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by other civilizations for centuries. Consider the implications of what Scripture tells us about Mizraim, the ancestor of the Egyptian peoples. The Hebrew text doesn't just identify him as Ham's son, but describes his lineage as destined for extraordinary achievements in construction, agriculture, and the preservation of knowledge. When we examine the actual accomplishments of ancient Egyptian civilization, we find perfect alignment with these prophetic promises. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the vast temple complexes, the sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed desert into fertile agricultural land, all represent fulfillment of divine programming embedded within Mizraim's genetic and cultural inheritance. But here's where the narrative takes a turn that will shock those who've been conditioned to think of ancient African achievements as primitive or derivative. The biblical timeline suggests that these civilizations weren't copying techniques developed elsewhere. They were the original innovators, the first to receive divine inspiration for architectural marvels, mathematical principles, and technological breakthroughs that other populations would later adopt and adapt for their own purposes. The book of Isaiah provides fascinating glimpses into the prophetic destiny of these populations. When the prophet speaks of the wealth of Egypt and the merchandise of Ethiopia coming to Israel, he's describing not just temporary political alliances, but the fulfillment of ancient promises about the role Ham's descendants would play in supporting and enriching the chosen people. These weren't conquered territories offering tribute under duress. These were prosperous, sophisticated civilizations, voluntarily sharing their abundance because they recognized their divine calling to support God's purposes on earth. Even more remarkable is what happens when we examine the specific individuals mentioned in Scripture who emerged from these lineages. The Ethiopian eunuch described in Acts chapter 8 wasn't just any government official. He was the treasurer of the entire Ethiopian kingdom, suggesting not only personal capability but representing a civilization sophisticated enough to maintain complex financial systems, international trade relationships, and administrative structures that required the highest levels of education and competence. The biblical account of this encounter reveals something profound about the spiritual sensitivity programmed into Ham's genetic inheritance. This Ethiopian official wasn't just accidentally reading Isaiah's prophecies when Philip encountered him. He was actively seeking divine truth, studying ancient Hebrew scriptures, and demonstrating the kind of spiritual hunger that characterizes populations specifically chosen to receive and preserve divine revelation. When we trace the migration patterns of Ham's descendants across Africa, we discover populations establishing centers of learning and spiritual authority that would influence human development for thousands of years. The ancient libraries of Alexandria represented more than academic achievement. They demonstrated the fulfillment of prophetic promises about Ham's lineage serving as guardians of knowledge, preservers of wisdom, and bridges between different cultures and civilizations. The kingdoms of Nubia, often overlooked in conventional historical narratives, controlled trade routes that connected Africa with Asia and Europe. These weren't primitive trading posts, but sophisticated commercial networks that required advanced understanding of geography, navigation, mathematics, and international diplomacy. The wealth that flowed through these kingdoms enabled architectural projects, educational institutions, and cultural developments that rivaled anything achieved by contemporary civilizations. But the biblical narrative suggests something even more profound about the spiritual calling of Ham's descendants. The text indicates that these populations carry within their genetic and cultural programming specific sensitivities to divine communication, particular gifts for prophetic insight, and unique capabilities for bridging the gap between earthly and heavenly realities. This explains the consistent pattern throughout Scripture of individuals from these lineages playing crucial roles in moments of divine intervention and prophetic fulfillment. The story of Moses' Ethiopian wife provides another fascinating glimpse into these spiritual realities. When Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses for marrying this woman, they weren't objecting to her character or capabilities. They were challenging a divinely orchestrated union that connected the Hebrew leader with a population specifically chosen to support and enhance his prophetic ministry. God's immediate defense of this marriage, including the punishment of Miriam with temporary leprosy, demonstrates divine approval of connections between the chosen people and Ham's spiritually sensitive descendants. The prophetic books contain numerous references to the future role these populations would play in God's ultimate plan for human civilization. Psalm 68 declares that princes shall come out of Egypt, and that Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. This isn't describing temporary political alliances or superficial religious conversions. These passages point toward the prophetic destiny of Ham's descendants to serve as leaders and spiritual authorities in the final chapters of human history. The book of Zephaniah provides even more specific details about this prophetic calling. The text describes worshippers from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia bringing offerings to the Lord, suggesting that Ham's descendants aren't just recipients of divine blessing, but active participants in global spiritual renewal. These populations carry within their heritage the keys to understanding aspects of divine truth that other lineages might struggle to comprehend. When we examine the geographical prophecies in Scripture, we find consistent patterns that validate the extraordinary destiny of Ham's descendants. The land of Cush is described as a place where divine messengers originate, where spiritual sensitivity flourishes, and where prophetic insight finds its most powerful expression. These aren't coincidental details scattered throughout Scripture. They represent a systematic revelation about the specific roles different populations were designed to fulfill in God's plan for humanity. The implications become even more profound when we consider how these biblical promises connect to contemporary realities. The demographic explosion of African populations in recent centuries aligns perfectly with ancient prophecies about the numerical increase of Ham's descendants. The emergence of African nations as significant players in global economics, politics, and culture represents the beginning fulfillment of promises about their influence extending across continents. But perhaps most significantly, the spiritual awakening occurring throughout Africa validates the prophetic promises about these populations serving as bridges between earthly and divine realities. The growth of Christianity across the African continent, the emergence of powerful spiritual movements, and the increasing influence of African theological insights all point toward the fulfillment of ancient promises about Ham's descendants stretching out their hands unto God. The biblical narrative suggests that we're witnessing the early stages of developments that will fundamentally alter the balance of global spiritual and cultural influence. The populations descended from Ham aren't just catching up to achievements made by other civilizations. They're beginning to manifest capabilities and insights that were programmed into their genetic and spiritual inheritance from the very beginning of human history. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into both historical patterns and future developments. The civilizations established by Ham's descendants weren't temporary achievements that rose and fell according to random historical forces. They represented systematic fulfillment of divine programming designed to prepare these populations for even greater roles in humanity's ultimate transformation. As we continue tracing these biblical lineages and their prophetic destinies, we'll discover how ancient promises connect to specific geographical locations, cultural achievements, and spiritual breakthroughs that validate the extraordinary calling placed upon Ham's descendants. The evidence we'll examine demonstrates that human diversity isn't accidental variation, but intentional divine design for accomplishing purposes that transcend anything previous generations could have imagined possible. The story we're uncovering reveals the magnificent scope of God's plan for different populations and challenges us to see human potential through the lens of divine purpose rather than human limitation. What emerges will fundamentally alter how you understand the relationship between biblical prophecy and contemporary reality, between ancient promises and modern fulfillment, between divine intention and human achievement. The revelations become even more extraordinary when we examine the specific prophetic utterances recorded in Genesis chapter 9, where Noah, under divine inspiration, pronounces blessings and destinies over his 3 sons that would shape the entire trajectory of human civilization. But here's what traditional theological interpretations have completely missed about these crucial verses. The Hebrew text contains layers of meaning that reveal divine programming embedded within different genetic lineages, each designed for specific functions in God's ultimate plan for humanity. When Noah declares the future of Ham's lineage, the original Hebrew terminology carries implications that go far beyond surface-level interpretation. The word used to describe Ham's descendants suggests populations destined for service, but not in the diminished sense that centuries of mistranslation have implied. This is service in the same sense that the Levites served in the temple, chosen for sacred duties that required extraordinary capability, spiritual sensitivity, and divine appointment for holy purposes. The biblical concept of service in this context represents elevation to positions of crucial responsibility, rather than reduction to subservient roles. Throughout Scripture, those called to serve God directly are consistently portrayed as receiving special gifts, enhanced capabilities, and access to divine knowledge that enables them to fulfill their sacred functions. Ham's descendants weren't assigned lesser roles, but specialized callings that would require unique strengths and spiritual insights. Consider how this prophetic programming manifests throughout biblical history. When Pharaoh needed someone to interpret his dreams and manage Egypt's resources during 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine, God raised up Joseph, who worked through Egyptian administrative systems and relied on Egyptian wisdom traditions to accomplish divine purposes. This wasn't coincidental cooperation between Hebrew revelation and Egyptian capability. This represented the fulfillment of ancient programming that designed Ham's descendants to possess exactly the knowledge and skills necessary for preserving civilization during times of crisis. The story becomes even more remarkable when we examine the specific technological and intellectual achievements that emerged from Ham's lineage. The biblical text suggests that these populations received divine downloads of information about mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and engineering that enabled them to create wonders that continue to baffle modern experts. The precision of pyramid construction, the sophistication of ancient irrigation systems, the complexity of astronomical calculations found in African archaeological sites, all point toward access to knowledge that transcends normal human discovery processes. But the prophetic dimensions extend far beyond historical achievements into predictions about future developments that appear to be reaching fulfillment in our current era. The book of Daniel contains fascinating references to kingdoms arising from the south that would play crucial roles in end-time events. When we trace these prophetic passages back to their geographical and genealogical origins, we find consistent connections to territories and populations descended from Ham's lineage. The prophet Ezekiel provides even more specific details about the role Ham's descendants would play in global transformation. His visions describe peoples from Cush and Put participating in massive coalitions that would shape the final chapters of human history. These aren't minor players or secondary participants. These are populations destined to serve as major influencers in events that will determine humanity's ultimate destiny. What makes these prophetic connections particularly compelling is how they align with contemporary demographic and political realities. The explosive population growth across Africa in recent decades corresponds perfectly with biblical predictions about the numerical increase of Ham's descendants. The emergence of African nations as significant players in global economics, natural resource control, and international diplomacy represents the beginning stages of prophetic fulfillment that ancient texts described in remarkable detail. The spiritual dimensions become even more profound when we examine how divine communication patterns have manifested throughout history within populations descended from Ham. The biblical record reveals consistent examples of individuals from these lineages receiving direct divine revelation, serving as prophetic vessels, and demonstrating supernatural capabilities that enabled them to fulfill crucial roles in God's plan for humanity. The Ethiopian eunuch's immediate understanding of Isaiah's prophecies, despite lacking formal Jewish religious education, demonstrates the kind of spiritual sensitivity that characterizes populations genetically programmed for prophetic insight. His instant recognition of divine truth and immediate response to spiritual conviction illustrates capabilities that go beyond intellectual comprehension into realms of direct spiritual perception. This pattern continues throughout church history with the rapid spread of Christianity across African populations and the emergence of distinctive theological insights that enriched global understanding of divine truth. The early African church fathers weren't just adopting European or Middle Eastern religious concepts. They were contributing original theological developments that demonstrated access to spiritual understanding specifically suited to their genetic and cultural programming. The monastic traditions that flourished in Egypt and Ethiopia represent more than religious devotion. They demonstrate the fulfillment of prophetic promises about Ham's descendants serving as bridges between earthly and divine realities. The mystical insights, the supernatural phenomena, and the spiritual authority that characterize these movements validate biblical predictions about the unique spiritual gifts embedded within these populations. But perhaps most significantly, the prophetic texts suggest that Ham's descendants carry within their genetic inheritance specific keys to understanding aspects of divine truth that will become crucial during humanity's final transformation. The book of Revelation contains mysterious references to sealed knowledge, hidden wisdom, and spiritual insights that will be revealed in the last days. When we trace the genealogical and geographical clues embedded within these passages, we find consistent connections to populations and territories associated with Ham's lineage. The implications extend far beyond theological curiosity into practical questions about contemporary global dynamics. If certain populations carry genetic programming that enables enhanced spiritual perception, prophetic insight, and divine communication, then their increasing influence in world affairs represents more than demographic shift or political development. It suggests the systematic activation of capabilities that were embedded within these lineages from the very beginning of human history. The technological innovations emerging from African populations in recent decades provide fascinating validation of biblical promises about Ham's descendants, contributing breakthrough discoveries that would benefit all humanity. The mathematical insights, the engineering solutions, the scientific breakthroughs that continue to emerge from these populations demonstrate the activation of genetic programming that was designed to manifest extraordinary capability when cosmic conditions became appropriate. The ancient texts describe specific environmental and astronomical factors that would trigger mass activation of dormant genetic capabilities within Ham's descendants. Solar activity, electromagnetic field changes, and planetary alignments all correlate with increased reports of spiritual experiences, prophetic insights, and breakthrough innovations within these populations. The same cosmic forces that ancient astronomers tracked and recorded appeared to be influencing contemporary manifestations of genetic programming that was encoded millennia ago. The medical and healing traditions that have characterized African cultures throughout history provide another window into the supernatural capabilities embedded within Ham's genetic inheritance. The knowledge of herbal medicines, the understanding of human anatomy, the ability to diagnose and treat conditions using methods that transcend conventional medical understanding, all point toward access to information that goes beyond normal learning processes. Recent scientific research into traditional African healing practices has revealed pharmaceutical compounds and therapeutic techniques that demonstrate sophistication rivaling modern medical discoveries. But rather than representing primitive folk remedies that accidentally stumbled upon effective treatments, these traditions appear to represent systematic preservation of medical knowledge that was divinely downloaded to specific populations, chosen to serve as guardians of healing wisdom. The agricultural innovations that enabled African civilizations to thrive in challenging environmental conditions demonstrate similar patterns of divinely inspired knowledge. The development of crop varieties suited to specific climates, the creation of irrigation systems that maximized water efficiency, the understanding of soil chemistry and plant nutrition that supported large populations in regions where other groups struggled to survive, all suggest access to information that transcends trial and error experimentation. The architectural achievements we've already discussed represent just the visible manifestations of deeper capabilities embedded within Ham's genetic programming. The ability to move massive stone blocks with precision that modern equipment struggles to replicate. The understanding of structural engineering that enabled monuments to survive millennia of natural disasters. The integration of astronomical knowledge into building design that demonstrates advanced mathematical comprehension, all point toward systematic activation of supernatural capabilities. But the biblical narrative suggests that these historical achievements represent merely the beginning of what Ham's descendants are destined to accomplish. The prophetic texts describe future developments that will see these populations playing central roles in humanity's ultimate transformation into forms of consciousness and capability that transcend current limitations. The book of Isaiah contains remarkable passages describing the wealth of nations flowing toward divine purposes, with specific mention of the treasures of Egypt and the merchandise of Ethiopia being consecrated for holy use. This isn't describing temporary political alliances or economic transactions. These passages point toward the systematic redirection of resources and capabilities developed by Ham's descendants toward accomplishing God's final purposes for human civilization. The geographical prophecies become even more specific when we examine references to the rivers of Ethiopia, the princes of Egypt, and the kings of the south mentioned throughout prophetic literature. These aren't vague symbolic references, but precise indicators of the territorial and political developments that would characterize the activation of Ham's genetic programming in the last days. The demographic realities of contemporary Africa align perfectly with biblical predictions about the numerical expansion of Ham's descendants. The continent's population explosion, the emergence of megacities, and the increasing global influence of African nations all correspond to prophetic promises about these populations becoming mighty and numerous beyond all previous historical periods. The educational and technological developments occurring across African nations provide contemporary validation of ancient promises about Ham's descendants, contributing breakthrough innovations that would advance human knowledge and capability. The emergence of world-class universities, research institutions, and technology centers throughout Africa demonstrates the activation of genetic programming designed to produce extraordinary intellectual achievement when environmental conditions became favorable. The spiritual awakening occurring across African populations validates the most profound prophetic promises about Ham's descendants, serving as conduits for divine revelation in the final chapters of human history. The growth of indigenous Christian movements, the emergence of powerful prophetic ministries, and the increasing influence of African theological insights all point toward fulfillment of biblical predictions about these populations, stretching out their hands unto God and receiving direct divine communication. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into the true scope of God's plan for human diversity and the specific roles different populations were designed to fulfill in accomplishing divine purposes. The story of Ham's descendants isn't a footnote in biblical history, but a central narrative that explains some of the most extraordinary achievements in human civilization and points toward even greater fulfillments yet to come. The prophetic tapestry becomes even more intricate when we examine the specific spiritual gifts and supernatural capabilities that Scripture attributes to Ham's descendants throughout the biblical narrative. These weren't random occurrences or coincidental manifestations of divine power. They represent systematic activation of genetic programming, specifically designed to enable these populations to serve as conduits between the divine realm and human experience. Consider the remarkable pattern that emerges when we trace instances of prophetic insight, divine communication, and supernatural manifestation within Ham's lineage throughout Scripture. The Ethiopian eunuch's immediate spiritual comprehension, the Egyptian magician's ability to replicate miraculous phenomena, the Cushite people's reputation for wisdom and spiritual sensitivity, all point toward populations carrying enhanced capabilities for perceiving and interacting with dimensions of reality that remain invisible to ordinary human consciousness. But here's where the narrative takes a turn that challenges every assumption we've been taught about the nature of spiritual gifts and divine calling. The biblical text suggests that these capabilities aren't randomly distributed among individuals based on personal worthiness or spiritual development. Instead, they appear to be systematically embedded within specific genetic lineages, passed down through generations as part of the divine blueprint for human diversity and purpose. The Hebrew terminology used to describe the spiritual characteristics of Ham's descendants reveals layers of meaning that have been consistently overlooked by traditional theological interpretation. Words translated simply as wisdom or understanding in English carry implications in the original language that suggest access to knowledge beyond normal human learning processes. We're talking about direct divine downloads of information, intuitive comprehension of complex spiritual principles, and ability to perceive prophetic patterns that transcend logical analysis. The historical evidence supporting these biblical claims becomes overwhelming when we examine the consistent pattern of breakthrough innovations and spiritual insights that have emerged from populations descended from Ham throughout recorded history. From the mathematical principles that enabled precise architectural construction to the astronomical calculations that guided agricultural cycles, to the medical knowledge that preserved life and health across generations, these achievements demonstrate access to information that couldn't have been discovered through conventional research methods. The ancient mystery schools of Egypt weren't just educational institutions. They were centers where genetic programming embedded within Ham's descendants was systematically activated and developed through specific spiritual practices and consciousness-expanding disciplines. The initiates who emerged from these schools didn't just learn abstract concepts. They developed practical capabilities for manipulating natural forces, healing physical ailments, and communicating with spiritual entities in ways that enabled them to accomplish seemingly impossible feats. The biblical account of Moses' education in all the wisdom of the Egyptians takes on profound significance when we understand that this wasn't merely academic training. Moses was being prepared for his prophetic calling by accessing the spiritual technologies and consciousness-expanding methodologies that Ham's descendants had preserved and refined over centuries. His ability to perform miraculous signs and wonders wasn't just divine empowerment working through an ordinary human vessel. It represented the activation of capabilities that became possible through his exposure to the advanced spiritual knowledge maintained within Egyptian mystery traditions. The prophetic books contain numerous references to the role Ham's descendants would play in preserving and transmitting divine knowledge during periods of spiritual darkness and cultural collapse. The libraries of Alexandria, the scriptoriums of Ethiopian monasteries, the oral traditions maintained by African griots, all represent systematic fulfillment of ancient promises about these populations, serving as guardians of wisdom and bridges between past revelation and future awakening. But the most extraordinary aspect of this biblical programming becomes apparent when we examine prophecies about the activation of dormant capabilities within Ham's descendants during the final chapters of human history. The texts describe specific cosmic and environmental conditions that would trigger mass awakening of genetic programming that has remained largely suppressed for centuries. Solar radiation changes, electromagnetic field shifts, and astronomical alignments all appear to influence the activation of supernatural capabilities within populations carrying these bloodline markers. The contemporary explosion of prophetic ministries, healing movements, and spiritual revival across African populations provides compelling validation of biblical predictions about end-time manifestations of divine power through Ham's descendants. These aren't isolated phenomena occurring in remote locations. We're witnessing systematic activation of capabilities that were encoded into genetic programming millennia ago, now manifesting simultaneously across different populations and geographical regions as cosmic conditions align for prophetic fulfillment. The technological innovations emerging from African populations in recent decades demonstrate another dimension of this genetic activation. The breakthrough discoveries in mathematics, the revolutionary approaches to engineering problems, the development of sustainable technologies that work in harmony with natural systems all suggest access to knowledge that transcends conventional educational and research methodologies. These innovations appear to emerge through intuitive insights and direct comprehension rather than gradual accumulation of information through traditional scientific processes. The medical and healing capabilities that continue to characterize African traditional practices provide another window into the supernatural programming embedded within Ham's genetic inheritance. Recent scientific analysis of traditional African pharmaceuticals has revealed compounds and therapeutic approaches that demonstrate sophistication rivaling the most advanced modern medical research. But rather than representing accidental discoveries through trial and error experimentation, these healing traditions appear to preserve systematic knowledge that was divinely downloaded to specific populations chosen to serve as guardians of health and restoration. The agricultural innovations that enabled African civilizations to thrive in challenging environmental conditions demonstrate similar patterns of supernatural knowledge preservation. The development of crop varieties that maximized nutritional value while adapting to specific climatic conditions, the creation of sustainable farming systems that enhanced rather than depleted soil fertility, the understanding of ecological relationships that enabled large populations to live in harmony with natural systems, all point toward access to information about natural laws and biological processes that goes far beyond ordinary human discovery capabilities. The architectural achievements we've examined represent visible manifestations of deeper mathematical and engineering knowledge that appears to have been directly programmed into Ham's genetic inheritance. The precision of ancient African construction techniques, the integration of astronomical calculations into building design, the understanding of structural principles that enabled monuments to survive millennia of natural disasters, all demonstrate capabilities that transcend what should have been possible using available tools and technologies. But the biblical narrative suggests that these historical manifestations represent merely the beginning of what Ham's descendants are destined to accomplish as their genetic programming reaches full activation. The prophetic texts describe future developments that will see these populations demonstrating capabilities that fundamentally alter human understanding of consciousness, natural law, and the relationship between spiritual and material reality. The book of Ezekiel contains remarkable visions of divine glory, manifesting through human vessels in ways that suggest direct merger between divine consciousness and genetically programmed human capability. The descriptions of wheels within wheels, living creatures with multiple faces, and beings that move with the speed of lightning all point toward future manifestations of supernatural ability that will emerge when Ham's genetic programming reaches complete activation. The geographical prophecies become even more specific when we examine references to the role African territories will play in end-time events. The mention of Cush and Put in coalition with other nations during final battles isn't describing random political alliances. These passages point toward the systematic activation of military and strategic capabilities within Ham's descendants that will enable them to play decisive roles in conflicts that determine humanity's ultimate destiny. The demographic explosion occurring across Africa aligns perfectly with biblical predictions about the numerical increase of Ham's descendants during the final generation before divine intervention reshapes human civilization. The emergence of megacities, the rapid population growth, and the increasing global influence of African nations all correspond to prophetic promises about these populations becoming mighty and numerous beyond all previous historical periods. The economic developments transforming African nations provide contemporary validation of ancient promises about the wealth and resources controlled by Ham's descendants flowing toward divine purposes. The discovery of vast mineral deposits, the development of renewable energy resources, and the emergence of innovative economic models all suggest systematic preparation for these populations to play central roles in supporting global transformation during humanity's transition into higher forms of consciousness and capability. The educational revolution occurring across African institutions validates biblical predictions about Ham's descendants, contributing breakthrough knowledge that would advance human understanding of fundamental reality. The emergence of world-class research facilities, the development of innovative educational methodologies, and the increasing global recognition of African intellectual contributions all demonstrate activation of genetic programming designed to produce extraordinary scholarly and scientific achievement. The spiritual awakening sweeping across African populations represents the most profound validation of biblical prophecies about Ham's descendants, serving as primary conduits for divine revelation in the last days. The growth of indigenous prophetic movements, the emergence of powerful healing ministries, and the increasing influence of African theological insights all point toward fulfillment of ancient promises about these populations receiving direct divine communication and demonstrating supernatural capabilities that validate their spiritual authority. The musical and artistic traditions that have always characterized African cultures provide another dimension of genetic programming that appears designed for specific spiritual and cultural functions. The mathematical precision underlying traditional African rhythmic patterns, the healing properties attributed to specific musical frequencies, and the ability of African musical traditions to induce altered states of consciousness all suggest capabilities that transcend ordinary artistic expression into realms of spiritual technology. Recent scientific research into the neurological effects of traditional African music has revealed patterns of brainwave entrainment and consciousness alteration that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how sound frequencies influence human awareness. These aren't accidental discoveries by primitive cultures stumbling upon effective techniques. They represent systematic preservation of technologies for consciousness manipulation that were embedded within Ham's genetic and cultural inheritance. The linguistic capabilities that characterize African populations provide additional evidence of genetic programming designed for specific communication functions. The tonal languages, the complex grammatical structures, and the ability to preserve detailed historical information through oral traditions all suggest enhanced capabilities for processing and transmitting information that goes beyond ordinary human linguistic capacity. The mathematical principles underlying African architectural and artistic traditions reveal systematic knowledge of geometric relationships, numerical patterns, and dimensional harmonics that demonstrate access to advanced mathematical understanding. The fractals found in traditional African art, the astronomical alignments incorporated into ancient buildings, and the mathematical precision of traditional craft techniques all point toward genetic programming that enables intuitive comprehension of complex mathematical relationships. The social and political innovations that characterized ancient African civilizations provide evidence of genetic programming designed for effective governance and community organization. The development of sophisticated administrative systems, the creation of legal codes that balanced individual rights with community welfare, and the ability to maintain stable societies across vast geographical territories all suggest capabilities for understanding and managing complex human relationships that transcend ordinary political and social skills. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into the true scope of divine intention for Ham's descendants and their role in humanity's ultimate transformation. The capabilities embedded within their genetic programming weren't designed for temporary historical purposes, but for functions that will become crucial as human civilization approaches its prophetic climax and transition into forms of consciousness and capability that fulfill the most extraordinary promises recorded in biblical prophecy. The convergence of all these factors, genetic activation, prophetic timing, demographic expansion, technological innovation, spiritual awakening, and global influence, suggests that we're witnessing the early stages of developments that will fundamentally alter human civilization and validate the most remarkable biblical promises about Ham's descendants, playing central roles in humanity's divine destiny. The convergence we're witnessing extends far beyond individual spiritual experiences into collective phenomena that suggest coordinated activation of genetic programming across entire populations. When we examine contemporary reports of supernatural manifestations, prophetic insights, and breakthrough innovations emerging simultaneously from different African regions, we find patterns that align perfectly with biblical descriptions of end-time outpourings of divine power through Ham's descendants. Consider what happens when populations carrying this genetic programming begin to recognize their shared heritage and coordinate their efforts toward common spiritual and cultural goals. The ancient texts describe this collective awakening as triggering exponential amplification of individual capabilities, creating synergistic effects that enable achievements far beyond what any single person could accomplish, regardless of their genetic inheritance or spiritual development. The technological revolution currently transforming communication and information sharing creates unprecedented opportunities for Ham's descendants to identify each other, share their experiences, and collaborate in ways that were impossible throughout most of human history. For the first time since the Great Dispersions following the Tower of Babel, these populations can connect across geographical boundaries, and coordinate the activation of their collective genetic programming. The implications become staggering when we consider the prophetic promises about what these populations would accomplish when their scattered fragments reunited and their dormant capabilities simultaneously activated. The biblical texts describe breakthrough discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of natural law, healing methodologies that would eliminate diseases that have plagued humanity for millennia, and spiritual insights that would bridge the gap between divine consciousness and human experience in ways that transform civilization itself. But accessing these collective capabilities requires more than just identifying genetic connections or sharing cultural experiences. The ancient texts provide specific guidance about the spiritual and psychological conditions necessary for full activation of the programming embedded within Ham's lineage. These include alignment with divine purpose, purification from corrupting influences, and development of consciousness states that enable clear reception of divine communication and supernatural empowerment. The systematic suppression campaigns we can trace throughout history were designed specifically to prevent this collective awakening by keeping Ham's descendants isolated from each other, confused about their identity, and disconnected from the spiritual practices that enable genetic programming to function properly. By promoting materialistic worldviews, encouraging sensual indulgence, and creating artificial divisions between related populations, these campaigns ensured that genetic capabilities would remain dormant even in those who possessed them. Yet the prophetic texts suggest that this suppression is temporary and will eventually give way to irresistible activation as cosmic conditions align for the fulfillment of ancient promises. The same astronomical cycles that ancient African astronomers tracked and recorded appear to be approaching configurations that will trigger mass awakening, regardless of external attempts at prevention or control. The demographic explosion across Africa in recent decades corresponds precisely with biblical predictions about the numerical increase of Ham's descendants during the generation that would witness divine intervention in human affairs. The emergence of megacities, the rapid urbanization, and the increasing connectivity between previously isolated populations all create conditions that facilitate the kind of collective awakening described in prophetic literature. The educational developments transforming African institutions provide the intellectual foundation necessary for populations to understand and develop their genetic inheritance. The emergence of world-class universities, research facilities, and technological centers creates environments where ancient knowledge can be rediscovered, validated through modern methodologies, and applied to contemporary challenges in ways that demonstrate the practical value of genetic programming that has been preserved for millennia. The economic transformations occurring across African nations provide the material resources necessary to support the kind of massive projects and global initiatives that the prophetic texts describe Ham's descendants undertaking during the final chapters of human history. The discovery of vast natural resource deposits, the development of renewable energy systems, and the emergence of innovative economic models all suggest systematic preparation for these populations to play central roles in reshaping global civilization. The spiritual revival sweeping across African populations represents the most crucial element in this prophetic activation. The growth of indigenous Christian movements, the emergence of powerful prophetic ministries, and the increasing reports of supernatural manifestations all validate biblical promises about Ham's descendants receiving direct divine communication and demonstrating capabilities that transcend ordinary human limitations. But perhaps most significantly, the prophetic texts describe specific signs and wonders that would accompany the full activation of genetic programming within Ham's descendants. These include healings that medical science cannot explain, prophetic insights that prove accurate beyond statistical probability, and demonstrations of supernatural power that validate the divine nature of capabilities embedded within these bloodlines. Contemporary reports from across African populations describe exactly these kinds of phenomena occurring with increasing frequency and intensity. Individuals with no formal medical training demonstrating healing capabilities that restore sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and mobility to the paralyzed. Prophetic ministers receiving detailed revelations about future events that prove accurate with remarkable precision. Technological innovators reporting breakthrough insights that arrive through dreams, visions, and direct spiritual downloads rather than conventional research processes. The consistency of these reports across different geographical regions, cultural backgrounds, and denominational affiliations suggests systematic activation rather than isolated coincidences. When the same types of supernatural manifestations begin occurring simultaneously among populations that share genetic markers but have no direct communication with each other, it indicates environmental or cosmic factors triggering dormant programming that was encoded into these bloodlines millennia ago. The ancient texts describe this activation process as irreversible once it reaches critical mass within populations carrying the appropriate genetic inheritance. Unlike individual spiritual experiences that can be suppressed through persecution or environmental manipulation, collective genetic awakening creates momentum that builds upon itself exponentially. Each individual who experiences activation makes it easier for others with similar programming to access their capabilities, creating cascade effects that accelerate the entire process. The global implications become profound when we consider that Ham's descendants represent a significant portion of world population and are distributed across every continent and major civilization. The simultaneous activation of genetic programming within these populations would fundamentally alter the balance of global capability, influence, and spiritual authority in ways that fulfill the most extraordinary biblical prophecies about the role African peoples would play in humanity's ultimate transformation. The technological innovations emerging from African populations provide tangible validation of prophetic promises about breakthrough discoveries that would benefit all humanity. The mathematical insights, engineering solutions, and scientific breakthroughs that continue to emerge from these regions demonstrate activation of genetic programming designed to produce extraordinary intellectual achievement when cosmic conditions become favorable for its expression. The medical and healing traditions that have always characterized African cultures are experiencing renaissance and validation as modern research confirms the effectiveness of therapeutic approaches that were preserved through oral tradition for thousands of years. Recent pharmaceutical discoveries based on traditional African medicinal knowledge demonstrate that these populations have maintained access to healing information that transcends conventional medical understanding. The agricultural innovations developed by African farmers to thrive in challenging environmental conditions provide models for sustainable food production that could address global hunger and environmental degradation. The crop varieties, farming techniques, and ecological approaches that enable large populations to live in harmony with natural systems demonstrate practical applications of knowledge about biological relationships and natural law that appears to have been directly programmed into Ham's genetic inheritance. The architectural principles underlying traditional African construction techniques continue to baffle modern engineers who struggle to understand how ancient builders achieved precision and durability that exceeds contemporary capabilities. The mathematical relationships, structural engineering, and astronomical integration found in African monuments suggest access to advanced knowledge that goes far beyond what conventional historical timelines would indicate possible. The artistic and musical traditions that characterize African cultures demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how sound, color, and geometric patterns influence human consciousness and spiritual perception. Recent scientific research into traditional African arts has revealed mathematical principles, therapeutic applications, and consciousness-altering effects that validate these cultural expressions as technologies for spiritual development and healing, rather than mere aesthetic creativity. The linguistic capabilities preserved within African populations provide evidence of enhanced communication abilities that enable more precise transmission of complex information across generations. The tonal languages, grammatical structures, and oral tradition techniques that characterize African cultures demonstrate genetic programming designed for effective information storage, processing, and communication that transcends ordinary human linguistic capacity. The social and political innovations that enabled ancient African civilizations to maintain stability across vast territories and diverse populations provide models for governance and community organization that could address contemporary challenges in human cooperation and resource management. The administrative systems, legal codes, and social structures that characterized these civilizations suggest genetic programming designed for understanding and managing complex human relationships effectively. The prophetic texts suggest that all these capabilities, technological, medical, agricultural, architectural, artistic, linguistic, and social, represent different aspects of integrated programming designed to enable Ham's descendants to serve specific functions in God's ultimate plan for human civilization. Rather than random talents or cultural accidents, these abilities appear to be systematic preparation for roles that will become crucial as humanity approaches its prophetic destiny and transformation into higher forms of consciousness and capability. The convergence of genetic activation, demographic expansion, technological innovation, economic development, educational advancement, and spiritual awakening within African populations suggests that we're witnessing the early stages of prophetic fulfillment that will fundamentally alter human civilization and validate the most remarkable biblical promises about the role Ham's descendants were chosen to play in humanity's divine destiny. The ancient manuscripts describe this awakening as accompanied by signs in the heavens, changes in natural phenomena, and demonstrations of supernatural power that would validate the divine nature of capabilities being activated within these bloodlines. Contemporary reports of unusual astronomical activity, electromagnetic field changes, and environmental shifts all correlate with increased manifestations of genetic programming among populations descended from Ham. The global recognition of African contributions to human knowledge, culture, and spiritual development represents reversal of centuries of systematic suppression and marginalization that were designed to keep these populations from understanding their true identity and divine calling. The increasing influence of African theological insights, technological innovations, and cultural expressions validates prophetic promises about Ham's descendants, eventually receiving the honor and recognition that their genetic inheritance and spiritual calling deserved. The economic developments transforming African nations from aid recipients to major players in global commerce and resource control demonstrate fulfillment of ancient promises about the wealth and abundance that would characterize Ham's descendants when their genetic programming reached full activation. The emergence of African economies as significant forces in international markets validates biblical predictions about the prosperity that would flow to these populations when cosmic conditions aligned for their prophetic destiny. The educational revolution occurring across African institutions creates the intellectual foundation necessary for these populations to understand, develop, and apply their genetic inheritance in ways that benefit all humanity. The emergence of world-class research facilities, innovative educational methodologies, and globally recognized academic achievements demonstrates activation of intellectual capabilities that were encoded into Ham's programming from the very beginning of human history. The spiritual authority emerging within African Christian movements provides validation of biblical promises about Ham's descendants, serving as primary conduits for divine revelation and supernatural power in the final chapters of human history. The prophetic accuracy, healing demonstrations, and spiritual insights that characterize these movements suggest direct divine communication and empowerment that transcends ordinary religious experience into realms of genuine supernatural manifestation. Understanding these developments through the lens of biblical prophecy provides crucial insight into both contemporary global dynamics and future possibilities that await as Ham's genetic programming reaches complete activation. The story we've uncovered reveals that human diversity isn't accidental variation, but intentional divine design for accomplishing purposes that transcend anything previous generations could have imagined possible. The implications challenge every assumption we've been taught about human potential, divine purpose, and the ultimate trajectory of human civilization. What emerges is a picture of systematic divine orchestration spanning millennia, with Ham's descendants playing predetermined roles that were established before the foundation of the world, and are now approaching their prophetic fulfillment in ways that will astound humanity and validate the most extraordinary promises recorded in biblical literature. The time of concealment appears to be ending as prophetic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of Ham's true identity, divine calling, and unlimited potential. The genetic programming embedded within these bloodlines represents keys to understanding aspects of reality, consciousness, and supernatural capability that will become crucial as humanity transitions into the final phase of its divinely orchestrated development toward forms of existence that fulfill the ultimate purposes for which our species was originally created. The convergence of these prophetic elements reveals something even more extraordinary when we examine the specific spiritual technologies that appear to be encoded within Ham's genetic programming. These aren't abstract theological concepts or mystical folklore. We're talking about practical methodologies for accessing dimensions of consciousness and reality that enable capabilities far beyond ordinary human limitations. Recent investigations into traditional African spiritual practices have uncovered systematic approaches to consciousness alteration, energy manipulation, and divine communication that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how human awareness interfaces with supernatural realms. The rhythmic patterns used in ceremonial drumming create specific brainwave frequencies that facilitate altered states of consciousness. The geometric designs incorporated into sacred art generate optical effects that influence perception and awareness. The medicinal plants utilized in healing rituals contain compounds that enhance neuroplasticity and spiritual sensitivity. But here's what makes these discoveries so significant. When modern neuroscience analyzes these traditional practices, researchers find levels of precision and effectiveness that rival the most advanced consciousness research being conducted in contemporary laboratories. We're not talking about primitive superstitions that accidentally stumbled upon useful techniques. These represent systematic preservation of technologies for consciousness expansion that were embedded within Ham's cultural inheritance as part of their genetic programming. The implications become staggering when we consider that these spiritual technologies weren't developed through trial and error experimentation. The biblical narrative suggests that Ham's descendants received direct divine downloads of information about how consciousness operates, how spiritual realms interface with material reality, and how human awareness can be enhanced to access supernatural capabilities. The traditional practices preserved within African cultures represent systematic maintenance of this divinely revealed knowledge across thousands of years. The prophetic books contain numerous references to the role these spiritual technologies would play during the final chapters of human history. The book of Joel describes outpourings of divine spirit that would enable ordinary individuals to prophesy, dream prophetic dreams, and see supernatural visions. When we trace the geographical and genealogical context of these promises, we find consistent connections to territories and populations descended from Ham's lineage. The manifestation of these capabilities in contemporary African spiritual movements provides compelling validation of biblical predictions about end-time demonstrations of supernatural power through Ham's descendants. The prophetic accuracy demonstrated by African ministers, the healing miracles occurring in African churches, and the supernatural phenomena reported across African populations all suggest systematic activation of genetic programming that enables enhanced spiritual perception and divine communication. But the activation process extends beyond individual spiritual experiences into collective phenomena that demonstrate the exponential amplification that occurs when populations carrying this programming coordinate their efforts. The ancient texts describe critical mass effects where individual capabilities merge into unified consciousness capable of manifesting changes in material reality through non-physical means. Contemporary reports from African spiritual communities describe exactly these kinds of collective manifestations. Groups experiencing simultaneous prophetic visions that prove accurate beyond statistical probability. Healing services where supernatural power flows through multiple individuals simultaneously. Prayer gatherings that produce measurable changes in weather patterns, agricultural productivity, and community health outcomes. The consistency of these reports across different denominational backgrounds, geographical regions, and cultural contexts suggests environmental or cosmic factors triggering mass activation of dormant capabilities. The same astronomical cycles that ancient African civilizations tracked and recorded appear to be approaching configurations that facilitate supernatural manifestation, regardless of individual spiritual development or religious training. The technological applications of these spiritual insights create possibilities that transcend conventional understanding of how innovation occurs. African inventors and researchers increasingly report receiving breakthrough solutions through dreams, visions, and direct intuitive downloads rather than systematic research processes. The mathematical principles, engineering approaches, and scientific discoveries emerging from these non-rational sources demonstrate capabilities that suggest access to universal knowledge databases through consciousness expansion techniques preserved within Ham's cultural inheritance. The medical applications become even more remarkable when we examine how traditional African healing methodologies interface with modern healthcare approaches. Hospitals and clinics across Africa report extraordinary healing outcomes when conventional medical treatment is combined with traditional spiritual practices. Cancer remissions, organ regenerations, and neurological restorations that medical science cannot explain occur with sufficient frequency to suggest systematic operation of healing mechanisms that transcend ordinary biological processes. The agricultural applications demonstrate similar patterns of supernatural enhancement of natural systems. African farmers utilizing traditional spiritual approaches to crop cultivation report yields that exceed expectations based on soil conditions, climate factors, and available resources. The blessing rituals, planting ceremonies, and harvest celebrations that characterize traditional African agriculture appear to activate beneficial relationships between human consciousness and natural systems that enhance productivity through non-material mechanisms. The economic implications become profound when we consider how these spiritual technologies could influence global resource distribution and wealth creation. The biblical promises about abundance flowing to Ham's descendants during their prophetic activation suggest not just individual prosperity, but systematic redirection of global resources toward populations carrying this genetic programming. Contemporary economic developments across Africa provide validation of these ancient promises. The discovery of vast mineral deposits in regions where traditional spiritual practices have been maintained. The emergence of renewable energy resources in territories where ancestral blessing ceremonies continue to be performed. The development of innovative economic models that integrate spiritual principles with practical business strategies. The educational revolution occurring across African institutions demonstrates how spiritual sensitivity enhances intellectual capability and learning efficiency. Students and researchers report breakthrough insights that arrive through meditation, prayer, and other consciousness-expanding practices preserved within traditional African spiritual systems. The integration of these methodologies with conventional academic approaches produces educational outcomes that exceed expectations based on available resources and institutional infrastructure. The political developments transforming African governance demonstrate how spiritual wisdom influences decision-making processes and community organization. Leaders who maintain connection with traditional African spiritual practices report receiving guidance about policy decisions, diplomatic strategies, and resource management through prophetic dreams and divine communication. The effectiveness of these spiritually informed approaches to governance validates the practical application of consciousness technologies preserved within Ham's cultural inheritance. The global influence of African spiritual movements provides contemporary validation of biblical prophecies about Ham's descendants, serving as conduits for divine revelation that would impact all nations. The theological insights, healing methodologies, and consciousness expansion techniques emerging from African Christianity are increasingly influencing spiritual movements worldwide. The recognition of African contributions to global spiritual development represents fulfillment of ancient promises about these populations serving as bridges between divine knowledge and human understanding. The artistic and cultural expressions emerging from African populations demonstrate how spiritual sensitivity influences creativity and aesthetic development. The music, visual arts, and literary works being produced by African artists consistently demonstrate mathematical precision, therapeutic effects, and consciousness-altering properties that suggest access to creative inspiration through spiritual channels. The global popularity of African cultural expressions validates their effectiveness in facilitating expanded awareness and emotional healing across diverse populations. The linguistic developments occurring within African populations provide evidence of enhanced communication capabilities that enable more effective transmission of complex spiritual and technical information. The emergence of new vocabularies for describing supernatural experiences, the development of more precise terminology for consciousness states, and the creation of linguistic frameworks for integrating traditional wisdom with contemporary knowledge all suggest activation of genetic programming designed for advanced information processing and communication. The social innovations emerging from African communities demonstrate how spiritual principles influence human relationships and community organization. The conflict resolution methodologies, resource sharing systems, and collaborative decision-making processes being developed within African societies consistently demonstrate effectiveness that exceeds conventional approaches to human cooperation. These innovations suggest activation of genetic programming designed for understanding and managing complex social dynamics through spiritual wisdom and enhanced interpersonal perception. The environmental applications of traditional African spiritual practices demonstrate understanding of how human consciousness interfaces with natural systems to influence ecological balance and sustainability. The conservation approaches, agricultural techniques, and resource management strategies that integrate spiritual practices with environmental stewardship produce outcomes that exceed expectations based on available technology and scientific knowledge. The prophetic texts describe these various applications of spiritual technology as preparing Ham's descendants for specific roles they would fulfill during humanity's ultimate transformation. The capabilities being activated within these populations aren't random gifts or cultural developments, but systematic preparation for functions that will become crucial as human civilization approaches its prophetic destiny. The astronomical alignments, electromagnetic field changes, and cosmic conditions that correlate with increased manifestations of genetic programming suggest that we're entering a period when dormant capabilities will be activated on a massive scale across populations carrying Ham's bloodline markers. The timing of this activation aligns perfectly with biblical prophecies about the final generation before divine intervention reshapes human civilization. The demographic explosion across Africa provides the numerical foundation necessary for the kind of global influence that prophetic texts describe Ham's descendants exercising during the last days. The emergence of megacities, the rapid urbanization, and the increasing connectivity between previously isolated populations create conditions that facilitate the collective awakening described in ancient manuscripts. The technological infrastructure developing across African nations provides the communication networks and information systems necessary for coordinating the kind of massive projects and global initiatives that biblical prophecies describe these populations undertaking. The emergence of advanced telecommunications, internet connectivity, and digital platforms creates unprecedented opportunities for Ham's descendants to identify each other, share their experiences, and collaborate in developing their collective genetic programming. The economic resources being discovered and developed across Africa provide the material foundation necessary to support the kind of transformational projects that prophetic literature describes. The vast mineral wealth, renewable energy potential, and agricultural productivity that characterize African territories suggest systematic preparation for these populations to play central roles in reshaping global civilization during humanity's transition into higher forms of consciousness and capability. The educational institutions emerging across African nations provide the intellectual framework necessary for these populations to understand, develop, and apply their genetic inheritance in ways that fulfill their prophetic destiny. The establishment of world-class universities, research facilities, and technological centers creates environments where ancient wisdom can be integrated with contemporary knowledge to produce breakthrough innovations that benefit all humanity. The spiritual authority emerging within African religious movements provides the divine validation necessary for these populations to fulfill their prophetic calling as bridges between supernatural and natural realms. The prophetic accuracy, healing demonstrations, and supernatural manifestations that characterize these movements suggest direct divine empowerment and communication that transcends ordinary religious experience. The global recognition of African contributions to human knowledge, culture, and spiritual development represents reversal of centuries of systematic suppression designed to keep these populations from understanding their divine identity and calling. The increasing influence of African innovations, insights, and inspirations validates ancient promises about Ham's descendants eventually receiving the honor and authority that their genetic programming and spiritual gifts deserved. The convergence of all these factors suggests that we're witnessing the early stages of prophetic fulfillment that will fundamentally alter human civilization and validate the most extraordinary biblical promises about the role Ham's descendants were chosen to play in humanity's ultimate transformation. The genetic programming, spiritual technologies, and supernatural capabilities being activated within these populations represent keys to understanding and accessing dimensions of reality that will become crucial as our species transitions into forms of existence that fulfill the divine purposes for which humanity was originally created. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual development or cultural achievement, into realms of collective transformation that could revolutionize human consciousness, capability, and civilization itself. The activation of genetic programming within Ham's descendants represents not just the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, but the beginning of humanity's evolution into forms of existence that transcend current limitations and enable the manifestation of divine purposes that have been planned since the foundation of the world. Understanding these developments through the lens of biblical prophecy provides crucial insight into both contemporary global dynamics and future possibilities that await as this genetic programming reaches complete activation. The story reveals systematic divine orchestration spanning millennia, with specific populations chosen and prepared for roles that will determine the ultimate trajectory of human civilization and consciousness. The time of concealment appears to be ending as cosmic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of Ham's true identity, divine calling, and unlimited potential. What emerges challenges every assumption about human diversity, spiritual capability, and the ultimate purpose of consciousness itself. The genetic inheritance embedded within these bloodlines carries keys to mysteries that will transform not just individual understanding, but the entire framework through which humanity perceives reality, possibility, and divine purpose. The prophetic framework becomes even more intricate when we examine the specific territorial assignments that were divinely orchestrated for Ham's descendants across the globe. These weren't random migrations driven by population pressure or resource scarcity. The biblical record reveals a systematic divine strategy for positioning these populations in locations that would enable them to fulfill specific functions in God's ultimate plan for human civilization. When we trace the post-flood dispersal patterns described in Genesis chapter 10, we discover that Ham's 4 sons established settlements that formed a strategic network spanning 3 continents. Cush planted roots in the regions we now recognize as Sudan, Ethiopia, and parts of southern Arabia. Mizraim's descendants flourished along the Nile River Valley, creating the foundation for Egyptian civilization. Put's lineage spread across North Africa, while Canaan's offspring settled in the fertile territories that would become crucial crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. But here's what makes this geographical distribution so remarkable. Each location chosen by Ham's descendants possessed unique natural resources, strategic positioning, and environmental conditions that would prove essential for developing the specific capabilities embedded within their genetic programming. The territories weren't just habitable land where displaced populations could survive. They were carefully selected environments designed to activate and nurture supernatural abilities that would remain dormant under different circumstances. Consider the profound significance of the Nile River Valley as the chosen homeland for Mizraim's descendants. This wasn't merely fertile agricultural land that could support large populations. The unique astronomical alignments, mineral compositions, and electromagnetic properties of this region created conditions that facilitated the kind of consciousness expansion and spiritual perception that enabled Egyptian civilization to achieve architectural and mathematical breakthroughs that continue to baffle modern experts. The pyramid complexes weren't just impressive monuments built by skilled craftsmen using advanced engineering techniques. Recent research into the electromagnetic properties of these structures reveals that they function as massive resonance chambers designed to amplify specific frequencies that influence human consciousness and spiritual perception. The precision of their construction, the mathematical relationships encoded in their dimensions, and their alignment with celestial bodies all suggest that Ham's descendants possessed knowledge about consciousness manipulation and energy dynamics that enabled them to create technologies for spiritual development disguised as religious architecture. The same patterns emerge when we examine the territorial assignments of Cush's descendants in the Ethiopian highlands. This region possesses unique geological formations, mineral deposits, and atmospheric conditions that create natural environments conducive to prophetic vision and divine communication. The ancient monasteries carved into cliff faces throughout Ethiopia weren't just remote locations chosen for spiritual retreat. They were specifically positioned to take advantage of natural phenomena that enhance spiritual sensitivity and facilitate direct divine contact. The historical records maintained by Ethiopian religious communities describe systematic preservation of consciousness, expansion techniques that were passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners. These weren't borrowed methodologies adapted from other traditions. They represent original spiritual technologies that were embedded within the cultural inheritance of Cush's descendants and refined through centuries of practical application. The territorial positioning of Put's descendants across North Africa demonstrates similar strategic planning for specific prophetic functions. The trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with Mediterranean civilizations passed directly through territories occupied by Put's lineage. This wasn't coincidental geography that happened to facilitate commercial exchange. These populations were divinely positioned to serve as cultural bridges, translating spiritual insights and technological innovations between different civilizations while maintaining their own unique identity and capabilities. The archaeological evidence from North African sites occupied by Put's descendants reveals consistent patterns of astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and architectural precision that demonstrate systematic preservation of advanced knowledge across millennia. The rock art, megalithic structures, and underground complexes found throughout these regions all point toward populations that maintained access to information about celestial mechanics, geometric principles, and consciousness manipulation that enabled them to create lasting monuments encoding their spiritual and scientific understanding. The assignment of Canaan's descendants to the crossroads between three continents reveals perhaps the most strategic positioning of all Ham's lineages. The territories they occupied controlled the land bridges between Africa, Asia, and Europe, making them inevitable participants in every major migration, trade exchange, and cultural interaction that shaped ancient civilization. This positioning wasn't accidental geography. It represented divine orchestration designed to ensure that Ham's spiritual insights and technological innovations would influence the development of all human populations. The biblical account of the conflicts between Canaan's descendants and other peoples takes on profound significance when we understand the spiritual dynamics involved. These weren't simple territorial disputes or ethnic conflicts. They represented spiritual warfare between populations carrying different types of genetic programming and divine calling. The intensity of these conflicts reflects the cosmic significance of controlling territories that possessed unique properties for consciousness development and supernatural manifestation. The prophetic books contain numerous references to the future role these territorial assignments would play during the final chapters of human history. The land of Cush is consistently described as a source of divine messengers and spiritual revelation. The territories of Mizraim are portrayed as centers of wisdom and technological innovation. The regions, occupied by Put's descendants, are depicted as strategic locations from which global influence would emanate. The crossroads, controlled by Canaan's lineage, are described as crucial battlegrounds where the ultimate destiny of human civilization would be determined. Contemporary geopolitical developments provide remarkable validation of these ancient territorial prophecies. The emergence of African nations as major players in global resource control corresponds directly to the geographical regions originally assigned to Ham's descendants. The discovery of vast oil reserves, mineral deposits, and renewable energy resources in territories that have been occupied by these populations for millennia suggests systematic divine preparation for their prophetic role in reshaping global economics and political power. The technological innovations emerging from research institutions established in these same territories demonstrate activation of genetic programming that was designed to manifest extraordinary capability when environmental conditions became favorable. The mathematical insights, engineering solutions, and scientific breakthroughs that continue to emerge from African universities and laboratories align perfectly with the intellectual capabilities that biblical prophecies attributed to Ham's descendants. The spiritual awakening occurring across territories originally assigned to Ham's lineage provides the most compelling validation of prophetic promises about these regions, serving as centers of divine revelation and supernatural manifestation. The growth of indigenous Christian movements, the emergence of powerful prophetic ministries, and the increasing reports of miraculous phenomena all correspond to geographical areas that were specifically chosen for these populations thousands of years ago. But the territorial prophecies extend beyond current political boundaries into future developments that will fundamentally alter global geography and resource distribution. The biblical texts describe massive geological changes, new land formations, and altered climate patterns that will create conditions favoring territories currently occupied by Ham's descendants. These aren't random natural disasters or environmental changes. They represent systematic divine restructuring of the Earth's surface to facilitate the prophetic destiny of populations positioned in specific locations. The agricultural potential of African territories provides another dimension of territorial blessing that aligns with biblical promises about abundance flowing to Ham's descendants. The soil compositions, climate patterns, and water resources found throughout regions assigned to these populations create conditions that could support massive population growth and agricultural productivity that would enable them to feed significant portions of global population. Recent agricultural innovations developed by African farmers demonstrate activation of genetic programming, designed for understanding and optimizing natural systems for maximum productivity and sustainability. The mineral wealth discovered throughout territories occupied by Ham's descendants corresponds precisely with biblical prophecies about the riches that would characterize these regions during their time of prophetic fulfillment. The gold, diamonds, rare earth elements, and energy resources found in these areas represent systematic divine preparation for these populations to control materials essential for technological development and global economic influence. The strategic positioning of these territories relative to major ocean currents, wind patterns, and transportation routes demonstrates divine planning for Ham's descendants to control global commerce and cultural exchange during their period of prophetic ascendancy. The ports, shipping lanes, and communication networks that connect these regions to the rest of the world create infrastructure that enables rapid expansion of influence and capability activation across global populations. The demographic explosion occurring in territories originally assigned to Ham's descendants aligns perfectly with biblical prophecies about the numerical increase of these populations during the final generation before divine intervention in human affairs. The emergence of megacities, rapid urbanization, and increasing population density create conditions that facilitate the kind of collective consciousness activation described in prophetic literature. The educational institutions being established throughout these territories provide the intellectual foundation necessary for Ham's descendants to understand and develop their genetic inheritance. The emergence of world-class universities, research facilities, and technological centers in regions that were considered backward or primitive just decades ago demonstrates systematic activation of capabilities that were embedded within these populations from their original territorial assignments. The cultural renaissance occurring across territories assigned to Ham's lineage validates prophetic promises about these regions becoming centers of artistic innovation and creative expression that would influence global aesthetic development. The music, visual arts, and literary works emerging from African populations demonstrate mathematical precision, therapeutic properties, and consciousness-altering effects that suggest activation of genetic programming designed for advanced creative capability. The linguistic developments occurring within populations occupying their original territorial assignments provide evidence of enhanced communication capabilities that enable more effective information processing and transmission. The preservation of tonal languages, complex grammatical structures, and oral tradition techniques demonstrates genetic programming designed for advanced communication that transcends ordinary human linguistic capacity. The social innovations emerging from communities established in territories originally assigned to Ham's descendants demonstrate activation of genetic programming designed for effective human cooperation and resource management. The conflict resolution methodologies, collaborative decision-making processes, and resource sharing systems being developed within these populations suggest capabilities for understanding and managing complex social dynamics that exceed conventional approaches. The environmental stewardship practices maintained by populations in their original territorial assignments demonstrate understanding of how human consciousness interfaces with natural systems to maintain ecological balance and sustainability. The conservation approaches, agricultural techniques, and resource management strategies that integrate spiritual principles with environmental protection produce outcomes that exceed expectations based on available technology and scientific knowledge. The prophetic texts suggest that these territorial assignments weren't just historical arrangements that served temporary purposes. They represent permanent divine positioning designed to enable Ham's descendants to fulfill specific functions throughout human history and into the future transformation of civilization itself. The capabilities being activated within these populations, the resources being discovered in their territories, and the strategic advantages provided by their geographical positioning all suggest systematic preparation for roles that will become crucial as humanity approaches its prophetic destiny. The astronomical alignments, geological formations, and electromagnetic properties that characterize territories assigned to Ham's descendants create natural conditions that facilitate the kind of consciousness expansion and supernatural manifestation described in biblical prophecies about these populations. The unique environmental factors found in these regions appear designed to trigger activation of genetic programming that enables enhanced spiritual perception, prophetic insight, and divine communication. The climatic patterns, seasonal cycles, and natural phenomena that characterize these territories align with the consciousness expansion techniques preserved within the cultural inheritance of Ham's descendants. The rhythmic patterns of weather changes, the electromagnetic variations associated with seasonal transitions, and the astronomical events visible from these geographical positions all create natural triggers for genetic programming activation and spiritual development. The mineral compositions, soil types, and water sources found in territories assigned to Ham's lineage possess unique chemical and energetic properties that influence human physiology and consciousness in ways that facilitate spiritual sensitivity and supernatural capability. Recent scientific research into the effects of specific mineral environments on human brain function and hormonal balance validates traditional knowledge about the relationship between geographical location and spiritual development. The plant communities, animal populations, and ecological systems that characterize territories occupied by Ham's descendants provide natural resources for consciousness expansion, healing, and spiritual development that were specifically designed to support the activation and maintenance of genetic programming embedded within these populations. The medicinal plants, ceremonial animals, and sacred sites found throughout these regions represent systematic divine provision for the spiritual and physical needs of populations chosen for specific prophetic functions. The territorial assignments established for Ham's descendants represent more than historical geography or cultural distribution. They demonstrate systematic divine orchestration designed to position specific populations in environments that would facilitate the activation and development of genetic programming essential for fulfilling their prophetic destiny. The convergence of genetic capability, territorial advantage, resource abundance, and environmental support creates conditions that enable these populations to manifest extraordinary achievements that validate the most remarkable biblical promises about their role in humanity's ultimate transformation. Understanding these territorial dimensions provides crucial insight into both historical patterns and future developments that will unfold as Ham's genetic programming reaches complete activation. The geographical positioning, natural resources, environmental conditions, and strategic advantages that characterize territories assigned to these populations represent divine preparation for roles that will determine the ultimate trajectory of human civilization and consciousness. The territorial blessings embedded within these assignments ensure that Ham's descendants possess all the environmental support necessary to fulfill their prophetic calling and accomplish the extraordinary purposes for which they were chosen and positioned from the foundation of the world. The convergence of genetic programming and territorial advantage creates possibilities for human achievement and spiritual manifestation that transcend anything recorded in previous historical periods. The activation occurring within these populations, supported by the unique properties of their assigned territories, represents the beginning of developments that will fundamentally alter human civilization and validate the most extraordinary biblical promises about the role Ham's descendants were destined to play in humanity's divine transformation. The territorial dimensions reveal only part of the extraordinary story that unfolds when we examine the specific spiritual gifts and supernatural capabilities that Scripture attributes to Ham's descendants throughout the biblical narrative. These weren't random manifestations of divine power or coincidental displays of unusual ability. They represent systematic activation of genetic programming specifically designed to enable these populations to serve as conduits between the supernatural realm and human experience. Consider the remarkable consistency of prophetic insight, healing capability, and divine communication that characterizes individuals from Ham's lineage throughout Scripture. From the Egyptian magicians who demonstrated supernatural abilities in Pharaoh's court, to the Ethiopian eunuch who immediately comprehended complex prophetic literature without formal training, we find repeated examples of enhanced spiritual sensitivity and supernatural capability that transcends ordinary human limitations. The Hebrew terminology used to describe these spiritual characteristics reveals layers of meaning that have been systematically overlooked by traditional theological interpretation. Words translated simply as wisdom or understanding carry implications in the original language that suggest direct access to divine knowledge databases, intuitive comprehension of cosmic principles, and ability to perceive prophetic patterns that bypass logical analysis entirely. The ancient mystery schools of Egypt represented more than educational institutions. They were centers where genetic programming embedded within Ham's descendants was systematically activated through specific consciousness-expanding disciplines and spiritual technologies. The initiates who emerged from these schools possessed practical capabilities for manipulating natural forces, accelerating healing processes, and communicating with supernatural entities in ways that enabled them to accomplish feats that seemed impossible according to conventional understanding. Recent investigations into traditional African spiritual practices have uncovered systematic approaches to consciousness alteration that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how human awareness interfaces with dimensions of reality normally invisible to ordinary perception. The rhythmic patterns used in ceremonial practices create specific brainwave frequencies that facilitate altered states of consciousness. The geometric designs incorporated into sacred art generate optical effects that influence perception and spiritual sensitivity. The medicinal compounds utilized in healing rituals contain elements that enhance neuroplasticity and divine communication. But here's what makes these discoveries so profound. When modern neuroscience analyzes these traditional methodologies, researchers find levels of precision and effectiveness that rival the most advanced consciousness research being conducted in contemporary laboratories. These aren't primitive superstitions that accidentally stumbled upon useful techniques. They represent systematic preservation of technologies for consciousness expansion that were embedded within Ham's cultural inheritance as part of their genetic programming. The prophetic books contain numerous references to the role these spiritual technologies would play during the final chapters of human history. The outpourings of divine spirit described in Joel, the supernatural demonstrations predicted in Isaiah, and the miraculous manifestations foretold throughout prophetic literature all point toward systematic activation of capabilities that have remained largely dormant within Ham's descendants for centuries. The manifestation of these abilities in contemporary African spiritual movements provides compelling validation of biblical predictions about end-time demonstrations of supernatural power. The prophetic accuracy demonstrated by African ministers, the healing miracles occurring in African churches, and the supernatural phenomena reported across African populations all suggest systematic activation of genetic programming that enables enhanced spiritual perception and direct divine communication. The technological innovations emerging from African populations demonstrate another dimension of this genetic activation. Inventors and researchers increasingly report receiving breakthrough solutions through dreams, visions, and direct intuitive downloads rather than systematic research processes. The mathematical principles, engineering approaches, and scientific discoveries emerging from these non-rational sources suggest access to universal knowledge databases through consciousness expansion techniques preserved within Ham's cultural inheritance. The medical applications become even more remarkable when we examine how traditional African healing methodologies interface with modern healthcare approaches. Hospitals and clinics across Africa report extraordinary outcomes when conventional treatment is combined with traditional spiritual practices. Regenerative healings, systemic restorations, and neurological recoveries that medical science cannot explain occur with sufficient frequency to suggest systematic operation of healing mechanisms that transcend ordinary biological processes. The agricultural innovations developed by African farmers utilizing traditional spiritual approaches demonstrate supernatural enhancement of natural systems. Crop yields that exceed expectations based on soil conditions, climate factors, and available resources suggest activation of beneficial relationships between human consciousness and natural systems that enhance productivity through non-material mechanisms. The artistic and musical expressions emerging from African populations consistently demonstrate mathematical precision, therapeutic effects, and consciousness-altering properties that suggest access to creative inspiration through spiritual channels. The global influence of African cultural expressions validates their effectiveness in facilitating expanded awareness and emotional healing across diverse populations worldwide. The demographic explosion across Africa provides the numerical foundation necessary for the kind of global influence that prophetic texts describe Ham's descendants exercising during the last days. The emergence of megacities, rapid urbanization, and increasing connectivity create conditions that facilitate the collective awakening, described in ancient manuscripts about critical mass effects and exponential capability amplification. The economic transformations occurring across African nations demonstrate fulfillment of ancient promises about abundance and prosperity flowing to Ham's descendants when their genetic programming reaches full activation. The discovery of vast natural resources, development of renewable energy systems, and emergence of innovative economic models suggest systematic preparation for these populations to play central roles in reshaping global civilization. The educational revolution transforming African institutions creates the intellectual framework necessary for these populations to understand and develop their genetic inheritance. The establishment of world-class universities, research facilities, and technological centers provides environments where ancient wisdom can be integrated with contemporary knowledge to produce breakthrough innovations that benefit all humanity. The spiritual authority emerging within African religious movements provides divine validation for these populations to fulfill their prophetic calling, as bridges between supernatural and natural realms. The prophetic accuracy, healing demonstrations, and supernatural manifestations that characterize these movements suggest direct divine empowerment that transcends ordinary religious experience into realms of genuine miraculous intervention. The global recognition of African contributions to human knowledge, culture, and spiritual development represents reversal of centuries of systematic suppression designed to keep these populations from understanding their divine identity and calling. The increasing influence of African innovations, insights, and inspirations validates ancient promises about these descendants eventually receiving the honor and authority their genetic programming deserved. Contemporary reports describe phenomena occurring with increasing frequency and intensity across African populations that align perfectly with biblical descriptions of supernatural capabilities. Individuals with no formal medical training demonstrating healing abilities that restore sight, hearing, and mobility. Prophetic ministers receiving detailed revelations about future events that prove accurate with remarkable precision. Technological innovators reporting breakthrough insights that arrive through direct spiritual downloads rather than conventional research methodologies. The consistency of these manifestations across different geographical regions, cultural backgrounds, and denominational affiliations suggests environmental or cosmic factors triggering dormant programming that was encoded into these bloodlines millennia ago. The astronomical cycles that ancient African civilizations tracked and recorded appear to be approaching configurations that facilitate supernatural manifestation regardless of individual spiritual development or religious training. The implications become staggering when we consider that Ham's descendants represent significant portions of global population distributed across every continent and major civilization. The simultaneous activation of genetic programming within these populations would fundamentally alter the balance of global capability, influence, and spiritual authority in ways that fulfill the most extraordinary biblical prophecies about their role in humanity's ultimate transformation. The prophetic texts describe this activation as irreversible once it reaches critical mass within populations carrying the appropriate genetic markers. Unlike individual spiritual experiences that can be suppressed through persecution or environmental manipulation, collective genetic awakening creates momentum that builds exponentially. Each person who experiences activation makes it easier for others with similar programming to access their capabilities, creating cascade effects that accelerate the entire process. The territorial advantages, natural resources, environmental conditions, and strategic positioning that characterize regions occupied by Ham's descendants provide all the material support necessary for these populations to manifest their full genetic potential. The convergence of activated programming with territorial blessing creates possibilities for achievement and influence that transcend anything recorded in previous historical periods. The linguistic capabilities preserved within African populations demonstrate enhanced communication abilities that enable more precise transmission of complex spiritual and technical information. The tonal languages, grammatical structures, and oral tradition techniques that characterize these cultures suggest genetic programming designed for advanced information processing that transcends ordinary human communication capacity. The social innovations emerging from African communities demonstrate activation of programming designed for effective human cooperation and resource management. The conflict resolution methodologies, collaborative decision-making processes, and resource-sharing systems being developed suggest capabilities for understanding and managing complex social dynamics that exceed conventional approaches to human organization. The environmental stewardship practices maintained by these populations demonstrate understanding of how human consciousness interfaces with natural systems to maintain ecological balance and sustainability. The conservation approaches, agricultural techniques, and resource management strategies that integrate spiritual principles with environmental protection produce outcomes that exceed expectations based on available technology. The convergence of genetic activation, territorial advantage, resource abundance, demographic expansion, technological innovation, economic development, educational advancement, and spiritual awakening within populations descended from Ham suggests systematic preparation for roles that will determine the ultimate trajectory of human civilization. The capabilities being manifested, the resources being discovered, and the influence being established all point toward fulfillment of ancient promises about these populations serving as primary agents of global transformation. The prophetic timeline described in biblical literature indicates that this activation process will accelerate exponentially as cosmic conditions continue to align for mass awakening. The environmental factors, astronomical cycles, and electromagnetic changes that correlate with increased manifestations of genetic programming suggest that we're approaching a period of unprecedented supernatural demonstration that will validate the most remarkable biblical promises about Ham's descendants. The implications challenge every assumption about human potential, divine purpose, and the ultimate trajectory of civilization itself. What emerges is systematic divine orchestration spanning millennia, with specific populations chosen and prepared for roles that were established before the foundation of the world, and are now approaching their prophetic fulfillment in ways that will astound humanity. The time of concealment appears to be ending as prophetic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of Ham's true identity, divine calling, and unlimited potential. The genetic programming embedded within these bloodlines carries keys to mysteries that will transform not just individual understanding, but the entire framework through which humanity perceives reality, possibility, and divine purpose. The biblical origin of Ham's descendants reveals a story far more extraordinary than random evolutionary development or cultural accident. It demonstrates systematic divine design for populations carrying specific genetic programming, territorial assignments, spiritual capabilities, and prophetic destinies that position them to play central roles in humanity's ultimate transformation into forms of consciousness and capability that fulfill the most profound purposes for which our species was originally created. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into both historical patterns and future developments that will unfold as this genetic programming reaches complete activation. The convergence of ancient prophecy with contemporary reality validates the most extraordinary biblical promises and challenges us to recognize divine orchestration operating through mechanisms that transcend conventional understanding of how history unfolds and human potential manifests. The evidence points toward developments that will fundamentally alter human civilization and consciousness in ways that fulfill prophetic promises made thousands of years ago. The activation occurring within Ham's descendants represents not just individual spiritual awakening, but collective transformation that will influence the destiny of all humanity as we approach the climactic moments of divinely orchestrated history. What you've discovered tonight challenges everything you thought you knew about human origins, divine purpose, and the true scope of biblical prophecy. The story of Ham's descendants isn't ancient history. It's unfolding reality that will shape the future of human civilization in ways that validate the most remarkable promises ever recorded in sacred scripture. The time of revelation has arrived, and the implications will transform everything.